I'm gonna say something to you right now that I've never said to no living soul in my life. I like Total War, both campaign and multiplayer. I watch both, I play both, and over the last 2 decades I've put some pretty obscene hours into both game modes. Neither one of them has ever come close to being perfect, and Total War multiplayer in particular has had some serious issues during the life cycle of the Warhammer trilogy, from balance problems to unviable units, subpar map design, the need for arbitrary rule sets in competitive play, and a general lack of support and functionality. We ran into stale metas and occasionally a downright unfun experience. But with the Warhammer 3 multiplayer embargo dropping this morning, I am happy to announce this series has taken a major step forward in fixing quite a few of these issues, because Domination Mode is here, and it is very likely the future of Total War multiplayer. It's quite unlike anything we've ever had in this series before. Yet fans of the Avatar Conquest mode from Shogun 2 will recognize some of its core features. So when you boot up the game for the first time and head over to multiplayer, you can access Domination Mode through the multiplayer lobby battle list feature or through ranked matchmaking. Once you get into a match with an opponent, you lock in your race using a blind pick feature, which means your opponent cannot see which faction you are playing as. And you're greeted with this screen, where you pick a small main army and a much larger reinforcing army. Your main army is the force you will begin the game with, attempting to gain map control and setting up for the coming fight. But the reinforcement army is where things start getting really interesting, because as you passively generate supplies, you can start summoning those troops onto the battlefield from predetermined locations. Every map is different, but each are characterized by forward Vanguard portals, where only Vanguard troops can spawn, and reinforcement points, where the bulk of your troops will be drawn from. At the top of the screen, you can see damage value dealt and total units for each player, the current duration of the match, which of the 3 capture points are under your control, your total victory points, and your total supplies, which is the resource you spend to summon more units onto the field. So for example, a Bloodthirster costs 2,300 gold. It will cost me 2,300 supplies to summon it onto the field for my reinforcement pool, which opens up some interesting strategies by itself. Do I spend a lot of money on having a greater demon at the start of the match, giving up map control by having a very small starting army, but controlling a super powerful unit that can goon out enemy casters and lords before they have the tools to deal with it? Or should I go super wide with lots of cheap fodder so I can easily cap points but have to wait longer to gather enough supplies to bring out the big toys? There is no right answer here, and with each faction and matchup playing differently, seeing how those tactics develop should be quite interesting over the first couple months after launch. So at the start of the match, you're essentially just posturing. There may be some minor skirmishes that break out, but you can't cap any points until 3 minutes into the game, which is designed so that slower factions like Nurgle have enough time to spread out and contest. Otherwise, Slanesh would just spam cav and blitz every single point right at the start of the match, which, by the way, is kind of a viable strategy anyway. You'll see that soon enough. But once that 3-minute grace period has ended, the capture points are up for grabs. Certain factions like Nurgle, who lack in the mobility department, are very good at holding objectives once they reach critical mass, storming the point with Nurglings, Plague Bears, healing spells, and a bunch of stuff to just overwhelm that area of the map. Others are designed better for picking and choosing engagements, isolating troops out on the flanks, running them down, and slowly gaining an advantage not by capping points, but by trading efficiently and forcing an opponent to waste money on reinforcements. As the match progresses, the action will escalate, as players spawn bigger, more impactful units and call upon larger numbers of reinforcements. So what started out as maybe 5 units versus 7 units will often end up with double or triple that number fighting for the objectives. Whoever gets to 5,000 victory points first wins. So if you triple cap an opponent and hold that, you could be down by like 4,000 points and still come back to win, because you will not generate victory points if you don't have any points at all. Now, one of the really interesting things about this game mode is that certain unit archetypes that rarely or never saw play in Warhammer 2 are quite a bit more viable in Domination. Troop choices like Longbow Riders or Vargheists, which perhaps would not have been used much in 1v1 multiplayer, are much more valuable now because they're so good at establishing aerial dominance and picking off isolated formations coming in to reinforce. In a straight 1v1, with an army all together moving as a big block, there's not enough room for Pegasus Knights to make much of an impact. But Domination doesn't play like that. It's spread out, encouraging you to utilize the entire map. The battles are more dynamic, with minor skirmishes breaking out everywhere, and it ebbs and flows in waves. So from the spectator side as well, I feel it might be a better viewing experience, because there's more time to soak all the action in, to see isolated engagements, for players to rectify a mistake and come back from it. There's just more room to breathe, even though it can sometimes feel a bit more hectic just because there's so much more movement happening. But while killing your enemy is extremely important, and you can bleed an opponent of their supplies by doing so, capping objectives is just as important, if not more so, because it's ultimately the only way to win. You can have a gigantic lead in damage value, and your enemy can only have like 2 Nurglings left, but if they've capped a point and have a large enough lead, they will still generate victory points and they can still beat you, even if they don't really have much of an army left at all. So if you want to cap those objectives efficiently, you need infantry, which is another unit archetype category that will play a much more important role than it has in the past, because infantry caps at double or triple the rate of every other type in the game, and they come in larger numbers, which means that 500 Nurglings can steal an objective from, say, 200 Chaos Warriors and a Bloodthirster if they're all fighting in the same capture area. Even though the value of the core units is higher, the Nurglings outnumber them, they'll be able to cap that point. Now naturally, the Coordinate units would crush that fight quite quickly, but swarming a point is a viable tactic to buy time for other troops to lumber their way over. So here are the modifiers for capping strength, so you guys can get a better picture of which troops are most efficient at taking objectives. Flyers have a 0 modifier, meaning that while they can establish map control quite well, they're terrible for actually capturing points. Artillery only has a modifier of 1, heroes, lords, and single entity monsters have a modifier of 2, cavalry has a modifier of 3, and infantry, including monstrous infantry, has a modifier of 6, which means they are way better and faster at capping, decapping, and overwhelming points than anything else in the game. Not to mention they have more models, so they have more weight for where that pendulum will swing over a contested point. But of course, infantry are much more susceptible to being picked off as they march, getting demolished by spells and surrounded by fast movers, so there's some give and take there. I'm quite sure there's a limit to how quickly you can take over an objective. It's capped out somewhere, but I'm not exactly sure what that threshold is, and there's plenty of info on the back end that we don't currently have access to, so I can't give you details on every single minutia of how this game mode works. But regardless, there's a cool dynamic here where it feels like most elements of your roster are important in some capacity and shine in various stages and roles of the match. I've got to say it, because reinforcements are a huge deal. Immediately, they solve one of the biggest issues that has plagued Total War multiplayer since time immemorial, a problem that has been especially detrimental in the Warhammer series, where factions are so incredibly diverse. The fact that you can lose a battle on the selection screen before a single shot has been fired or a single sword swung. I mean, seriously, how many times have you seen or played a faction that just straight up lost before the battle even started? Because the matchup is just ass, or because you were expecting one thing and your opponent brought something completely different and you simply don't have the tools to counter it. That is one of the biggest selling points of this game mode. You don't automatically lose on the selection screen because you brought the wrong units. If you have plague drones in your reinforcing army and they happen to suck against whichever faction you go up against, then you can just not recruit them during the battle and focus on reinforcing with other units that are better choices in that particular scenario. If this was Warhammer 2 and you brought the wrong stuff, they would generate little value and you'd be at a gigantic disadvantage, sometimes an insurmountable one. By the same token, if you bring Scarbrand as your lord and he gets sniped out early, it's certainly going to be an issue for you, but there are built-in comeback mechanics that will help you crawl your way back into the game after a rough start. You don't just automatically lose because you took one bad engagement or had your general sniped immediately, which in turn means that it's a lot easier to get into multiplayer because the pre-battle build isn't as important. You don't have to spend dozens of hours watching replays to see how people create armies for specific matchups. As that match develops, you can see what your opponent is summoning onto the field, and you can pull from a wide selection of units to help counter those attacks. The fact that you're not locked into any one particular army already means there's a dynamism here that Warhammer 2 lacked. With that said, Domination is not perfect in its current form, and will need some tweaking in the coming weeks and months. Replays are lacking some functionality at the moment. They don't give viewers all the info they need to watch. For example, replays don't show damage value in the top left like it does in battle, and there's currently no tab that shows which units are available to reinforce, which I think is important information to know. Also, quite a few of my games end somewhat abruptly and anticlimactically, with tons of cool units on the field without being able to use them. Even when you've double capped your opponent or dominating the engagement and the comeback is on, many times the game will just end. I don't have specifics thought out yet on exactly how it would work, but some kind of overtime mechanic that shuts off reinforcements at the end of the game allows both armies to fight it out with whatever's on the field, and then whoever's last man standing gets a small to moderate points boost, would make the end of battles much more interesting and exciting. There could be some crazy comebacks in this game mode, don't get me wrong. I've seen a couple where you're at like 4,800 points, 4,900 points, and your opponent is right there with you, and it's a race to 5,000. Those are awesome. But sometimes it just kinda ends with a whimper, and I think a situation where, like in free-for-all, being last man standing doesn't give you the win, but it does give you some points, would allow a bit more comeback potential if you had a bad start but finished really strong, and would help factions that maybe get the ball rolling a bit slower in the end game. It can feel a bit bad to finally get that double Bloodthirster build going, be in the middle of a really cool fight, and then the match just stops. And there's also some issues with trading, where you can kind of cheese the point system a bit. Basically, if you let your opponent triple cap you at the start, you get extra supplies as part of the built-in comeback mechanic. So if you just focus on taking really good engagements, you can let them almost win on victory points, but you'll have way more supplies to work with by the time endgame rolls around. So you can reach a critical mass where you take over the map, camp his spawn, triple cap him yourself, and then cruise to a brutal comeback. So you can literally let them get like 4,700 points, and if you time it well and took really good engagements throughout the battle, you can come all the way back simply because you got a huge, overwhelming advantage because of the extra supplies you generate passively from being behind. I don't think that's consistent, and it takes some doing, but there are definitely some values that will need tweaking as we move forward and players get more experience with the game mode, because I imagine some of the competitive guys will find some pretty nasty shit as we get maybe a couple weeks, couple months into the game. A new feature set like this simply isn't going to launch without its share of problems, but the future is bright here. Most of the multiplayer content creators I've played with and talked to absolutely love Domination. It's fresh, it's enjoyable, it addresses a lot of the issues from previous games. The map pool is limited, but each are handcrafted and really well designed, and simply put, it's a hell of a lot of fun. The blueprint is there for an amazing Warhammer 3 multiplayer experience. You'll be seeing a lot of Domination in the coming days and weeks, makes for very interesting battles and replays, and should be quite the spectacle on the viewer side as well. Hope you guys enjoy this overview, and I will see you all in the next one. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.